a Chevron organization. In fact, when they first rolled out, it was actually called Chevron Texaco, and then gradually the Texaco went away, and today is Chevron. And I was very, very fortunate to have an HR business partner in there working with me, and she said, wow, we can make a difference on this. And so we really partnered together, and it was the first time that I really started to think about change management as a discipline. So that was about 20 years ago, and since then I've been super, super fortunate to do what I like to do every day. I'm very passionate about it. I do actually call myself kind of a change nerd. I think you sort of change geek sometimes, if you will. So when I started to think about what to talk about, and there's a lot of different things that I could talk about, I really kind of came back and focused on the idea, something I'm really becoming passionate about is the idea that we tend to think about change as a project. You know, it's like, Brian mentioned at the beginning, well, I'm working on a project where we're deploying SAP, Salesforce, and SuccessFactors. And we are in fact doing that. But that is almost really this part of what we are trying to do and need to do at Stericycle to be successful. So we, a couple other things that are happening. We have a brand new COO who's been named president, who is clearly going to become the CEO, that all of the writing is on the wall. That actually caused the departure of another executive member. We recently settled a $300 million suit. You know, in our current organization, we cannot tell you who one customer is. We can tell you who a customer is, but we have probably 20 contacts from that customer, and who knows how many people in the organization own that customer. We have more than 500 applications, including more than 80 payroll systems. And we have a nice little group of people up in Lake Forest who sit in a room and key in some payroll information because not all of our systems talk to each other. EDI doesn't work with all of our applications. So we have a lot going on. So when we think about change as a project, it's really easy for us to kind of box in and say we're doing an SAP project, we're doing a Salesforce. Really what we're doing is building a future Stericycle that will either save the company or not save the company, frankly. And it is positioned, maybe not precisely in those words, but is very definitely positioned as the future of the company to Wall Street. So when I think about change, there were kind of, and I apologize for notes, but I thought, well, we're doing informal, so I'm going to keep a couple notes here to remind me of some things I want to say. I think there's three things I'd like to talk to you all tonight, and that is, given that change is not an event anymore or a very specific project, but really, you know, our world, I'd like to talk to you about how we can help not only our impacted end users, but really truly our leaders. How do we help our leaders figure out how to help those people that are not just going through one change in one day, but really are having on almost every day trying to figure out some way around change. So that's a key part of it. Let's see. All right, I think I mostly covered that. Here's the three things. And actually what I'm going to do is just give you this whole deck because it's got other information in it. It's actually something I used internally at another company on it. But I really want to start the conversation out by asking that question. And let me see if I can tell you which slide to go to. So I have my glasses on top of my head. Oh, would you go to slide, sorry, 4. So, I always like to start with a little bit of humor because you have to have a lot of humor to work in organizational change. And I like this one because it talks about, it's our friend Dilbert, and he says, you know, our differentiating value-added strategy is transformational change, which how many times has anybody in this room heard the word transformational change, right? Well, how does that make anybody feel? You feel a little different? Well, my urge to hurl has increased a little. And my urge to hurl increases a lot every day on that. So that's what change feels like. Kind of a funny way to think about it. If you might think about it another way, so Adlai Stevenson, I used to have this on the door in my office at Tyson, change is inevitable and change for the better is a full-time job. And that really, I think, is something that we can all leave with, right? It is a job now. When I graduated from the University of Tennessee in 1982, it was not a job. I graduated with a degree actually in broadcasting and ended up in employee communications. But I think that's the cool thing today. We can actually really help impact those changes and help make changes better. Okay, so I want to start out slide 7, if you would. change is a big word, and there's lots of different perspectives on it. So first of all, there's like what I always say, it's my perspective and your perspective, but we could go around the room and say the same thing. There's really two. One is it's the personal perspective, right? It's the impacted end user, it's you, and that can be all kinds of things. That can be something like, I'm a great example. I just moved for the 17th time, have a second level completely full of boxes. Who knows when they'll be unpacked, hopefully before my next move. It could be as simple as, one of my favorite personal changes was I did some work in Charlotte one time, and I was new to Charlotte, and I knew exactly one route to get to work every day. So guess what happened to me one day? The road is closed, right? Yeah. So I come up to this road that has a sign that I can't go down now, a little bit of panic. Now, it's true that we all have these wonderful GPS built into our cell phones, and we can navigate it around. But in that moment, that was a really big change for me, and I needed to figure out how to do it. So we're all used to those personal changes. Your favorite store closes, you have to go a different route, you have to move 17 times. And so, I think there's that perspective of it, but then there's that business change, right? So there is deploying SAP and Salesforce and whatever else the heck we can find there, right? It's reorganizing, it's having a brand new COO. It could be even just moving a job within the company. Why? I'd love to hear from you all. Why do you think that's important to think about both of those perspectives? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
I would say because personal change is going to be individualistic. Like everyone's going to have their own perspective and vision, and taking that into consideration. Kind of comparing it, especially whenever you're trying to make a change on the organizational level.
Yep.
I think those are two very important factors to keep in any sort of decision-making process.
Yep, I would agree. So when you're working with leaders in your organization, when you're starting your new PMO or doing any of the things that you all were coming here to kind of learn tonight, how much do you think that they're thinking about the personal perspective of change? Now, we often are, right? We're thinking about stakeholders, but how many of you think that's one of the first things your leaders are thinking about? Probably not at all, right? Because they're thinking about, I got to meet this budget, or I have to make Wall Street happy, and that's okay. But what I want us to start doing is changing the conversation and helping our leaders think about change as a competency and a capability and something they have to help us enable as leaders to really make that change successful. So I promise you that sometime in between January and July of 2020, we will train and enable somewhere around 25,000 people to use a variety of new systems, right? We'll have drivers and trucks who are using new handhelds. Our finance and accounting organization may finally not have to use an abacus, but truly be able to use the system. And by the way, we can actually come up with one number instead of 3 or 4 different numbers. That's what our revenue is. So that's actually the easy part of change. The harder part of change is by that time, there'll already be something else happening for a big change, right? Our COO will probably be our CEO, and she'll have reorganized the organization, or she'll have said, here's a new industry that we're going to get into, or we'll have a new learning and management. There's all kinds of things that can happen by that point in time. So what I really think think our charge is for the future as change people is to get our leaders to start thinking about first of all, how did they face change, not as an event, but also how they help their people and support them through that. I worked with some people at State Farm a couple of years ago, and there was one particular guy that we were working with, and this gentleman his dream job was the lead of a region, and there was another guy that had that job, and another guy was in there. And he was in there for about 30 years. And then one day he announced his retirement. So my guy was like, my dream job is right there. So anybody want to take a stab at what happened next? Well, if you know anything about State Farm, they've very, very much completely reorganized in the last few years. They went from a zone structure to basically, they have regional headquarters, and some in Dallas, actually, in Richardson. They have one in Atlanta. And the dream job that this guy had waited his whole career for literally went away. It didn't exist anymore. I actually, just a few weeks ago at a conference, heard that 35% of the future jobs for our kids' generation that are coming out now don't even exist now. So a lot of our motivation for, we tell people as we're going through a change, don't worry, this will be better for you and you'll grow in the organization and this will help you become, have new skills and do new things. How do we tell people that when we don't even know what skills they need to have? We don't even know what their jobs are going to be. We don't even know. At Stericycle right now, one of the things that they're facing is people have been so focused on trying to enter the data or get the data in the systems or share the data or find the data that doesn't even exist. Really what they're going to have to do tomorrow is they'll have the data. They'll have the data really easily. Now we need them to start thinking about analytics and how do we use the data and what kind of data do I need next and what's the data telling me. So that's a whole different way of coming to work every day. And most of us are pretty happy with what we're doing. We're not really thinking about that. So I think our future challenge in change is to, one, start thinking about making sure the personal perspective comes into it, and two, really helping our leaders think about change not as an event, but as an internal leadership capability that they really need to grow first, and that we need to help grow and encourage among our team members. So I want to pause there and see any questions, any thoughts about that. Andrew, you ever experienced any of that?
In my experience, I've had the privilege, in quotes, of leading transformation initiatives, frankly, for the last 12 years. And I came to a realization after speaking with Kathi, who we just met. We met at a prior conference briefly. But I'm that person responsible for initiating the change in large organizations, typically Fortune 500. I personally haven't been on the receiving end. I haven't been a change target or a change recipient. So I forgot how it feels to have change thrusted upon me, because I've been the thruster for the last 15 years. And a lot of what Kathy's speaking about is very similar to my experience with people here about where you're rolling out numerous systems, new processes, new roles and responsibilities. It's a challenge. And the biggest challenge we have as change practitioners is making sure that we can sit in their shoes and understand what the impact of that change is as we're receiving that change. Change management is critical to everything we do.
And I think a reason I really wanted to open with this is, so I know a number of you are students, so as you transform through your career and you go out to look for a job in the big wide world, one of the things you'll see is first of all, a couple interesting things. I went to ACMP a couple years ago, and they listed the number of titles of people who were attending the conference and were in theory doing some form of change management. A little bit of project management, but some change management. I think there were 150 different titles. So when people say to me, well, how do I go out and try to find a change management job? I'm like, well, you have to be pretty creative, right? You have to use a lot of keywords and try to figure out what it is. My particular title has been the last few times organizational change, which, by the way, my CIO hated. He thought I was trying to take over HR and design an organization. And I said, one of the reasons why we came up with it is we are thinking about the organization, right? We are thinking about the leaders and the future of the organization. And the organization, by the way, is people. And the second thing is, it's very important because I was working in IT at Tyson, that people not think I'm the change control board. I'm not ITIL, I'm not security, I'm not a change control. I'm thinking about the people. The people are my target. So I think, again, our world is changing. Kind of interesting that we all have a lot of different titles on that. Would you go to slide 13 for me? I want to switch and talk a little bit about get like a framework for what's really happening in our world and what is leading to it changing so much. So a couple things as we consider change and as you consider it as a career and how can I help people. It's very important for us to think about the fact that we're just living in a different world. And so I'm 58 years old. I'm going to be 60 really, really soon. And I spent the Thanksgiving holidays with my nieces and nephews, and they still like to kid me about growing up in Central Illinois and having a party line. Anybody here know what a party line is? So a party line was, I lived in the country, and we had a phone line that we shared with our neighbors. So I was a teenager, So often there would be a situation of where I would call one of my friends in town and we would have a long conversation about something, boys, could have been a television show. And my neighbors would pick it up the phone and say, okay, you've been on the phone half an hour. You need to get off the phone so I can make a phone call. And so, listen, they can't even understand that, right? My first cell phone was the phone in the bag that I, plugged into my car. And okay, I'm almost 60, but all of that has happened in my lifetime. Large industrial change used to happen every several hundred years. Major change now is happening even as often as every 18 to 24 months. So I have a couple examples on here that sort of, for me, gave a great frame out for it. So in year 2000, there were 97 million mobile phone subscribers. There were absolutely 0 Facebook users. This is 2000. That's really not that long ago. Amazon had 20 million users. Now, just fast forward just 10 years. I just picked 10 years to do it. 293 million mobile phone subscribers, 116 million Facebook users, and 285 Amazon users. Of course, that's 10 years ago, or almost 10 years ago, right? So who knows what those figures are now. And I think this is really important. First of all, I tend to be a bit of a history buff. I'm currently trying to read my way through the Hamilton book, which is fascinating and is 725 pages, in case you're interested. But it's important for us to think about what are some of the reasons why it is changing so much, right? We have a tendency to be accused as change management professionals to say, you're just making it kind of worse than it is. We're not making it worse than it is. This is what the world is. These are some of the things that are happening in our environment. And frankly, when you go out to do stakeholder analysis, when you go out to try to help the leaders, you have to think about what's happening in the world around us. That gives us our framework and our context for how people are reacting to that change. So I think it's really important, and one of the conversation pieces that we can share with our leaders as to why we're living in a changed world. So not surprisingly, if you could hit the next one, it's happening even faster. Estimates are actually pointing to the fact that over the next 100 years, 5 times more scientific developments will happen than have happened before. So it's almost difficult for me to understand how much it is. But a couple things we could think about from that are disruptive development. So think about Ubers and taxis, which in a city like here we do. I actually take a Lyft to work now, which is a concept I never ever thought before in my life. If you think about hotels that I've stayed in many, many times over my years, Airbnb, VRBO, those are actually what most people think first of now rather than hotels. It's fascinating. So I won't go through all of them, but again, I think context. When we start trying to talk to our leaders and getting them to think about why is change so difficult? Why do we have to think about the personal side? Why do we have to compare that with the business side? It's because it's happening faster and faster and faster in that. I want to share, if you could go to the next slide, a slide that I like to talk a lot about with this. So it gets a little more cliche as we talk about it, but think about the industry leaders of the 90s. Sears, a favorite one to talk about here in Chicago, right? I actually grew up, again dating myself, at a time when the Sears catalog at this time of the year was the big deal. Anybody ever have the Sears catalog? I know probably not you all, but anybody here, did you have the Sears catalog? So the Sears catalog was literally a catalog, a big old giant catalog. We didn't have sticky notes in those days, so we bent down the corners and we circled around. And it was a really big deal. It was a huge part of our growing up. And in such a short period of time, it's literally gone away. Again, when we think about the perspectives of change, one of my favorite companies on here is Kodak. So Kodak actually developed the first digital camera and completely let it slip away from them. So imagine being at Kodak in that period of time, and you have leaders who are thinking, this is a throwaway camera, right? Digital will never take over those print pictures that people put on the walls in their home, that people take out and the grandparents show them, right? Imagine being an employee in that environment, developing that camera and saying, hey, I have this innovation. I've come up with something new. It's a lot more portable. My niece this weekend just took pictures at my nephew's wedding. She took 3,000 pictures in one day. Now, we're not going to print all those. In fact, she's not printing any of them. My niece and his fiance that got married are just taking a disc away from that. So if you we just think about that one particular example, this is some of the context that's happening, that all of our changes are happening around. All right. I want to talk a little bit, let's see, would you go to 17? If our world is changing, the way that we help with change is changing too, right? Makes sense. So a couple things. Traditional change, again, was leader-driven, very top-down. The organization would come out and make an announcement, and that is how the information would come down. Visionary and transformational leaders really, hopefully that's me, were the ones who, they were up there, saying from the mount, right? This is what we're going to do. Everything was very project managed and phased. It was very specific. It was very structured. It was very boxed in. Resistance was not to be tolerated. The status quo, think about my guy at State Farm who tried to find the same job, work for the same job. Status quo was what you were looking for. And stakeholders didn't have a choice to be engaged. In fact, not very long ago, I had a conversation with a vice president of the bank at USAA, and he said, "Can't I just make them do it?" That was very traditional, right? It was a little military. It was very structured. Think about change happening in organizations. I think about the change, Andrew, that you and your team just went through. It's going all directions. It's not just top down. It's coming out from the bottom. It's going sideways. There's new organizations and business units springing up. Sometimes it's hard to figure out who all is changing and how they're changing. Much, much different to manage, right? Now you tend to have leadership that tends to be very purposeful, hopefully, in good organizations, right? And they're looking at a range of possibilities. Hopefully they're not throwing away the digital camera and the digital pieces of that. We are working in agile environments, right? So you're prototyping things, spitting things out faster. One of the reasons that we are able to, in a little over a year, put together 3 major systems is because we're working in an agile, we call it WAGile, to be honest with you. It's not true Scrum, but we are developing, looking at it, reviewing, developing again, really, it's a year. Typically, most typical SAP projects before have been at least 3 to 5 years, maybe longer. The last large SAP project that was done at Tyson before I joined was about a 9-year project. So that won't fly anymore in today's environment. There's going to be a whole nother SAP thing out there. So stakeholders have a bigger piece in that. So let me ask you all a question. Why do we care about that as change people? How does that impact what we do? Would you slide to the next slide? I guess I'd just ask you, even as what you're doing now, why would you care about that? Why would you care about, traditional change and new change?
The cycles for getting the change implemented are shorter.
Right.
So
Almost every conference I go to now. Right. We glossed over it, but in here for you is the whole change cycle. You start out and you start at the top, you go into the pool of uncertainty, right? And then you hopefully come back at the top, right? How do you do that? First of all, when there's so many changes happening at the same time, ProSci has a great roadmap that they use to show what all the different changes and where people are on that. But how do you manage change, right, in that very structured way, especially if you think you have to plan for change and manage change and reinforce change and all the different models that we're using. These are some of the things that we have to face as leaders in change now. So I want to give you two kind of quick case histories. So let's see, if you want to go to slide, and I don't want to take all your time, 23, sorry. Being almost 58 means I need glasses. So I want to give you a little snapshot, 2 minutes, okay. I want to give you a little snapshot of a change within a change, a part of an organization I worked at that had very continuous change. So it was Tyson. I always like to, sometimes I'll try to say it was a top 100 food manufacturer, but it was Tyson Foods, right? We were rolling out a brand new SAP S/4HANA. We had purchased Hillshire Farms about 4 years before, and we had never fully integrated. So this technology project was to drive us and get us on the same thing. We were in the process of changing out our top leadership. So the CEO that had been there actually since he graduated from college about 35 years ago was in the process of being slowly retired out. A new leader coming from Hillshire Farms was coming on. That caused a lot of changes in our upper leadership. And really what happened was we were 5 months, I started to share this with Brian, we were 5 months from deployment, and we got a new CTO who walked in the second week he walked in said, the whole program is paused. And so now we had a whole group of stakeholders whose whole life for the last 2 years had been, get this program done, get people ready, start training, think about awareness, build, develop, test. And it was actually turned out to be a really interesting change project for us. So how do you help those people deal with a great deal of uncertainty? We had about 2 months of uncertainty before we started to roll out a new project. Even in that uncertainty, you have some exciting but still terrifying changes that are happening. You have a brand new CTO, very dynamic, very engaged, always wanting to change things up. So we had to take a really deliberate way to help our internal team try to deal with that, right? So we did a couple things. One, we turned it into a summer of learning. We said, typically in the middle of a project, you'd be working your butt off. There wouldn't be any extra Fridays off. So we actually took the whole New York model of only get off at noon on Fridays, work your 40 hours before noon, and you can take the weekend off. We actually started a summer learning series. So we gave people the opportunity to say, use this pause to go out and gain new skills that you think you're going to need to. We held Scrum classes, Agile classes, actually talked to people about how to adapt to change. So we did very deliberate things like that. We encouraged people to take time off. But one of my favorite conversations during that time was really with some of the people on my change team, and they said, this is the hardest change I've ever been through. I'm used to helping people through change. I'm not used to going through the change myself. So I actually encouraged my team to use it as a moment where it could be a learning moment for them. And literally, the cobbler's kids had shoes. Oops, sorry, that didn't work out too well. Did a lot of leader coaching, helped them understand why change was important in that. So this was a great opportunity for us to sort of practice our own skills on that. I'd be happy to share more information about it, but I do want to kind of make sure everybody has some time on it. And I actually do a whole case history on building an internal capability, but I'm going to stop and see if you have any questions. And again, I think there's a couple things I'd like you to leave with. One, change is not an event. It's continuous and ongoing. I think our challenge as change professionals is to really stop thinking about it, and this is super hard, but stop thinking about it as just a project and really thinking about how do we enable it as a capability, for sure, among our leaders. How do we help our leaders start thinking about really supporting people through what is essentially continuous change instead of one change, not just SAP, but really where are we going? Help build different motivation for them in organizations that are not the same and are not going to be the same, much different way to motivate people. And then really build a historical context. Help people understand it's not just Stericycle, it's not just Tyson, it's not just Ulta, right? It's really happening in our larger environment, in our larger world. And there's some great lessons that we can take from that, I think. Yes?
Do you think that change capability
Is different than what? I'm sorry?
and just good leadership? Is change capability different than good leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that if you are a good leader, you can have a change capability, but I absolutely think it's very different. And so one of the things I actually certify people and help teach them change. And one of the things I talk to them about is that most leaders today, if they were getting an MBA or some kind of business degree, did not have a class on change. They might have had, maybe in some leadership programs, they do have some psychology classes. But honestly, what we're dealing with is the behavior of people. And change capability, first of all, they have difficulty understanding it themselves, let alone being able to enable it. And that part of leadership, I read a definition the other day of leadership, which is leadership isn't about you. It's about the people you're leading. I mean, it's really about that. So if we think about change capability from that, I don't think that most people know how to do that. And I don't think it's not a purposeful thing, right? They're not ignoring it. They just literally don't know how to do it. Yes.
So I've worked in change-related roles across the years now. The biggest resistance I've seen is from the word change.
Mm-hmm.
Just having
Oh, yeah.
a separate function.
Yeah, absolutely.
Telling you what to do. So the people just stop listening right there.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen any other way of bringing change in as part of some other function, like as part of your project management,
Mm-hmm.
as part of your project plan? It's one item, or it's something that goes through
Right.
the project plan versus someone coming in as the organization change consultant or whatever.
Yeah. So actually, that is exactly what the new CTO at Tyson resisted. He hated the idea of organizational change. They ended up changing them to call transition readiness. And what I said to him at the time was, I actually don't care what you call a team as long as you keep the functionality. They started out in the PMO. I do think that you see more success when you get someone.
They reached the enterprise, reached over 60,000 associates. However, I was instructed to call it something other than a.
The reason we were very successful at Tyson, even for that period of time, was because they had actually been doing change for about 19 years, primarily through consultants. And so they knew what good change could do. They just didn't know how to build it internally. And that is, I think, what a lot of companies get frustrated with. Because even if they're willing to invest in it, it's often like one person or two people, and you can do good things with one person. You can teach a lot of people, and you can enable the leaders, which I think was a great thing to call out. But you're still going to be limited. So for you to really be successful, you have to and we actually made the investment because we could save about $20 million in consulting fees by building an internal capability. And our goal was to essentially send them back to the business at some point and then start to grow change capabilities within the business, which I think is ultimately your big success factor. So that's